They stripped her clothes in front of everyone. Laughter echoed in the hangar, sharp and mocking. The air was thick with the smell of jet fuel and sweat, the sound of tools clanging and engines humming. A group of young men stood in a semicircle, elbows nudging each other, whispering under their breath. One even raised his phone, pretending to check the time, but it was clear what they were waiting for. As she unzipped her coveralls, her movements were slow and deliberate. No rush, no hesitation. She wasn't trying to hide the discomfort, but there was no sign of fear either. She had been through worse. Her eyes were calm, unwavering. There was a practiced precision in her actions, a quiet resolve that didn't need to announce itself. Then, she turned her back to them. That's when the commander walked in. Everything stopped. The hangar, once full of laughter, became eerily silent. The men who had been so bold just moments ago were now frozen, staring at the tattoo on her spine. It wasn't just any tattoo. It wasn't a design chosen for style or decoration. It was a symbol, a marker, and it was something no one was supposed to see. In an instant, the men who had humiliated her weren't laughing anymore. They had no idea who they were dealing with. It was just a routine inspection for Layla Rourke. Or so they thought. But this wasn't her first time in a place like this. And the tattoo on her back? It told a story that no one in the hangar could have ever imagined. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. This is a story you'll remember long after the sound fades. She walked into that hangar like she belonged there. Not with swagger or attitude, but with the quiet certainty of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. There was nothing about her that screamed for attention, nothing that demanded respect, but the way she carried herself spoke volumes. Her name was Layla Rourke. At first glance, you wouldn't think much of her. Early 40s, maybe pushing 50. Graying hair pulled back in a neat regulation bun. Coveralls that had seen better days, and steel-toed boots that showed real wear. She didn't look like the type to turn heads. She didn't need to. Layla was the kind of person who faded into the background. At least, that's how she appeared. She didn't stand out in the crowd. She didn't need to. Her clipboard was battered, showing signs of long days in the field. It was clear she had seen more than most people would in a lifetime. The tools hanging from her belt weren't shiny new gadgets, but tools that had been around for years, worn with use, each one earning its place by her side. There was no pretension, just the quiet presence of someone who had learned to survive and thrive in environments most would consider hostile. But here's the thing about assumptions. They're dangerous when you're dealing with people whose stories you don't know. Layla wasn't some contractor fresh off the street. She wasn't a mechanic who got lost in the noise. She was a force in her own right, and the men in the hangar had no idea who they were dealing with. Not yet. She didn't need to announce herself. Her work would speak for her, as it always did. The midday sun had turned Falcon Ridge Air Station into a furnace. Heat waves shimmered off the tarmac, making the entire base feel like it was melting under the weight of the desert heat. Inside Hangar 7, the air conditioning struggled to keep up, working overtime against the oppressive temperature. It was a constant battle, but the equipment had seen worse. And so had the people who worked here. The smell of jet fuel mixed with a scent of hot metal, the distinct cocktail of sweat, grease, and machinery that every mechanic knew by heart. Power tools buzzed in the background, engines hummed with life, and somewhere in the far corner, a radio crackled with tower communications. To the untrained ear, it was all just noise. To the ones who had been around, it was the soundtrack of a life spent in constant motion, where the only thing that mattered was getting the job done. Layla signed in at the duty station, her movements precise and practiced. Her handwriting was clean and blocky, the kind that comes from years of filling out forms in sandstorms, signing reports while mortars fell in the distance. There was no wasted motion, no hurry. just the calm efficiency of someone who had learned to adapt, to survive, to endure. The duty sergeant, an older NCO with grease under his fingernails and decades of aircraft maintenance in his eyes, glanced at her paperwork without really looking. His job was simple: check the details, sign off, and keep the hangar running. He did a double take when he saw the name on the form. It had been a while since they'd had someone from Isla's company come through. The last guy hadn't known a rotor hub from a landing skid. Isla didn't bother with pleasantries. She wasn't here to make friends. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here to do the job, and she did it better than most. She was one of the best. But no one knew that yet. The hangar was busy. Mechanics shuffled from station to station. Airmen in their sharp uniforms moved with purpose, and a few contractors like Isla worked quietly in the corners. It was the kind of place where no one looked too closely at anyone else. Everyone had a job to do, and that was the end of it. That's when Lance Corporal Trent Harper decided to make her his entertainment. Harper was 22, fresh out of technical school, and still carrying the swagger that came with his rank. He wore his uniform sharp enough to cut paper, his boots gleaming in the harsh light of the hangar. The world was his oyster, and everyone around him needed to recognize it. He had no real experience, but he had something that most didn't: a loud voice and an inflated sense of authority. In his mind, the chevrons on his sleeve gave him permission to treat anyone below his rank however he wanted. Layla Rourke? She was just another contractor in his eyes, another cog in the machine. Maybe she was older, maybe she looked experienced, but that didn't matter. In his world, rank meant respect and volume meant authority. He thought he could handle her the same way he handled everyone else, with impatience and a touch of disdain. "Excuse me, ma'am," Harper called out from across the room, making no move to approach her. He didn't need to. He was in charge. "You here for the avionics inspection?" Isla didn't respond immediately. She just looked up from her clipboard with a calm gaze that lingered for a moment. There was no hostility in her eyes, just a quiet focus. She didn't challenge him, but she didn't back down either. "Structural assessment," she said, her voice even. "Going to need to see your clearance documentation. New security protocols." Harper made a show of examining her paperwork, squinting at the stamps and signatures like he was some kind of expert. Behind him, 3 other mechanics had gathered, drawn in by his theatrics. Specialist Morrison, barely 19, with soft hands that had never touched anything more complex than a lawnmower before joining the Air Force. Private First Class Chun, who spent most of his time playing video games and complaining about military food. And Senior Airman Rodriguez, who should have known better, but was too busy trying to impress the younger guys to speak up. "Clearance says you're good for structural assessment," Harper said, his voice dripping with mock superiority. "But that's not the same as avionics access." He looked at the paperwork again, still unsure but unwilling to admit it. "You're gonna need to verify that you're not carrying any contraband devices." The hangar, already filled with the hum of machinery, grew quieter. The subtle shift in the air was palpable, a shift in tension. The air in the hangar thickened. Harper wasn't backing down. His audience of younger mechanics stood by, eyes wide, waiting for a show. In his mind, this was his moment to flex his muscles. He wasn't just enforcing security protocol. He was proving something, to them and to himself. "I'm gonna need you to verify you're not carrying anything," Harper said, his tone sharpening. "Electronics, recording equipment, transmitters, could be sewn into clothing, hidden in undergarments. Full compliance check required." Isla's expression didn't change. She wasn't nervous, wasn't angry. She simply stood there, calm and unmoving, as if she had expected this. The clipboard in her hands never wavered. The room around them seemed to hold its breath. Tools kept whirring, engines hummed, but the whispers from the small crowd of mechanics had quieted to a low murmur. The kind of murmur that spread when something didn't feel right, when the line between professional conduct and personal humiliation was about to be crossed. Harper's grin widened. He saw this as an opportunity to show off in front of his peers. He wanted to belittle her, to assert control over someone who wasn't in his chain of command. He didn't care if it was inappropriate. He was in charge now. Rodriguez, who had been watching from a distance, shifted uncomfortably. "Harper, maybe we should." "No," Harper cut him off, his eyes locked on Isla. "I'm in charge here. This is protocol." Morrison, who had been nervously glancing between Harper and Isla, finally spoke up. "She knows the regs better than you do, Harper." But Harper wasn't listening. He was too far gone now. The game was in motion, and nothing could stop it. He was ready for the moment when she'd break, when she'd let him humiliate her like the others. Isla didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply responded. "Strip search. Top half. Standard procedure for uncleared personnel in restricted areas." The lie hung in the air. It was an obvious one that everyone in the hangar knew. But Harper wasn't backing down. He thought he was in control. And that's when it happened. Isla began unzipping her coveralls. The hangar fell into a stunned silence. The moment Isla started unzipping her coveralls, the mood shifted. Not out of discomfort, but out of something else, something deeper. The mechanics stood frozen, unsure of what they had just witnessed, but they didn't move. They were locked in, watching as she revealed more than just her plain gray t-shirt beneath. The fabric of her coveralls whispered as it slid off her shoulders, revealing the soft, faded cotton of her shirt. There was nothing flashy about her appearance. No jewelry, no fancy undergarments, just the bare essentials. She wasn't trying to make a point, wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply following the absurdity of the situation to its inevitable conclusion. She pulled her coveralls down to her waist, tying the sleeves around her hips. There was a brief pause, the room holding its collective breath as if waiting for something. Some indication that this wasn't real. But there was no show, no dramatic flourish. Isla simply stood there, arms at her sides, her gaze steady and calm. "Satisfied?" she asked. Harper was grinning now, enjoying the discomfort he had caused, basking in the power he believed he had over her. He was still focused on the control he thought he held. The uniform, the rank, the moment that felt like his victory. Then she turned. The t-shirt clung to her back, revealing the tattoo that stretched down her spine, like a lightning bolt of ink. It wasn't a design, wasn't a tribute, wasn't some rebellious act. It was a classification, a military insignia. The downward-pointing triangle, the numbers etched into her skin, and the silhouette of the bird of prey. All of it was military. All of it was classified. Most of the men didn't understand what they were looking at. They dismissed it, probably assuming it was some old war relic tattoo, something from a bygone era of military service. But Rodriguez, who had grown up in a military family, felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen those markings before. That bird wasn't just any tattoo. It was the mark of something that wasn't supposed to exist. The hangar seemed to hold its breath as Colonel Darius Von walked through the doors. His presence hit the room like a wave of cold air, cutting through the tension. The folder he was carrying slipped from his hand and hit the concrete floor with a sharp slap that echoed through the vast space. His eyes were locked on Isla, standing there with nothing but her faded t-shirt and that tattoo that no one was supposed to see. The room was deathly silent now. His two senior officers, a major and a captain, looked at him in confusion, then followed his gaze. They both froze, understanding nothing of what was happening, but recognizing the gravity of the moment. Harper, still standing with a self-assured grin, hadn't yet processed what was unfolding. But that grin faltered when he saw the look in Fun's eyes. "Jesus Christ," Fun whispered, his voice low, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He stepped closer to Layla, his eyes scanning the tattoo on her spine. He knew what it meant. He had seen it before, in reports and classified documents, a symbol tied to something buried so deep, it was supposed to be forgotten. Harper's smugness vanished, replaced by a cold sweat creeping down his neck. He realized in that instant that he had no idea who this woman was. She wasn't some contractor, some civilian to be toyed with. She was someone far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Colonel Fun's voice cut through the stillness. "I'll handle this from here, Corporal," he said, his tone like steel. Harper's face went pale. The control he thought he had was slipping away, unraveling in front of his eyes. His bravado evaporated as the magnitude of the situation became clear. Fun turned to Layla, his voice softer now. "Ma'am, you can get dressed." Layla didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded once, methodically pulling her coveralls back up and zipping them with the same precision that had guided her every action since stepping into the hangar. No shame, no anger, just quiet dignity. Behind her, the mechanics shifted uncomfortably, now understanding that they had witnessed something far beyond their comprehension. As Layla finished dressing, the atmosphere in the hangar shifted again, though this time it was with a different kind of tension. The air, which had been thick with discomfort and power struggles, now hummed with the weight of realization. The men who had gathered around were still reeling, the reality of what had just occurred settling in. Fun's voice broke the silence once more. "Anyone who talks about what just happened will be washing dishes in the mess hall until their enlistment expires." The order was clear, and the room emptied quickly. The younger airmen scrambled to leave, their faces pale with understanding. Harper tried to stay behind, stammering a half-hearted excuse, but Fun's gaze silenced him before he could speak. "I'll see you in my office at 1400 hours, Fun said, his voice as sharp as a knife. "And bring your supervisor." Harper's bravado was gone. His confidence had turned to dust, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew it wasn't going to be good for his career. He stood frozen for a moment before turning and quickly exiting the hangar, the weight of his actions sinking in with every step. Layla, on the other hand, was already back to work. She didn't flinch. She didn't demand apologies or recognition. She simply moved on, her focus unwavering as she continued with the inspection. The report would get filed, the machinery would be checked, and the job would be done with the same quiet competence that had earned her respect, even if the others hadn't quite realized it yet. This wasn't her first run-in with misunderstanding, and it wouldn't be the last. But she would do what she always did, get the job done, without the need for recognition, just like the many times before. As Layla moved through the inspection with the same quiet professionalism that defined her every action, word of what had happened began to spread throughout the base. It wasn't long before the story reached the senior NCOs and crew chiefs, who stopped by Hangar 7 for no particular reason other than to see the woman who had just been humiliated by a group of young men, and to see how she responded. Master Sergeant Williams, who had been fixing helicopters since before most of the crew was born, watched her with an appreciative eye. As she inspected the tail rotor assembly, she spoke without looking up. "Blade tracks off by about 2 millimeters, she said casually, tracing her fingers along the component. "Probably been that way for weeks." Williams checked the maintenance logs. Sure enough, the pilots had reported vibrations, but nothing serious enough to ground the aircraft. His eyebrows raised in surprise. "How did you spot that without running the engine?" he asked. "Feel the blade tips," Layla responded, her tone almost too casual. "Weight distribution tells you everything." By the time she finished her inspection, there wasn't a single mechanic in the hangar who hadn't learned something new. They were seeing her for what she truly was, a professional who understood the intricacies of machinery like few others could. When she finally completed her report, It wasn't just thorough. It contained recommendations that would prevent potential failures that no one else had even considered. Williams signed off as a witness, his respect for her clear. Later that day, Finn took a quiet moment to look at her report and reflect. He knew the lesson she had taught everyone in that hangar was more important than any repair or checklist. Excellence didn't announce itself. It just showed up. The story of Layla Rourke didn't end in Hangar 7. It echoed throughout the base, a lesson that would resonate for months to come. The mechanics, airmen, and even the officers who had been present would never forget what happened. They had learned that true respect isn't earned through rank or force. It's earned through quiet competence and dignity. Have you ever encountered someone who was underestimated because they chose to stay quiet? Drop your thoughts below. We read every single comment. If this story hit you differently, if it made you think about the power of humility and respect, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories about the heroes who never ask for the spotlight. This story might be over, but the lessons it carries will stick with you long after the sound fades. Stay tuned for more.